The gentle spring breeze rustled through the oak trees of Riverside Park, carrying the distant laughter of children playing at the playground. It was one of those perfect April afternoons where nature seemed to be showing off, not too hot, not too cold, just right for studying outdoors. And that's exactly what brought the bright-eyed 16-year-old girl to this quiet corner of the park. She had carefully chosen her spot, spreading her favorite blue blanket under the shade of a massive oak tree, far enough from the playground to avoid distractions, but close enough to feel safe in the family-friendly atmosphere. Her AP biology textbook lay open beside her, surrounded by colorful sticky notes and highlighters. She was the kind of student who took her education seriously, maintaining straight A's while juggling volunteer work at the local animal shelter. Her dad, a high-ranking police officer in the city's force, had always taught her the importance of finding peaceful places to study. The right environment, he would say, helps your brain work better. She smiled, remembering how he'd specifically recommended this park during breakfast that morning. Her father knew every safe spot in the city like the back of his hand, and his recommendations were always spot on. As she flipped through her textbook, occasionally pausing to jot down notes about cellular respiration and enzyme functions, the world around her continued its peaceful rhythm. An elderly couple walked their golden retriever along the nearby path, offering a friendly wave as they passed. A group of mothers with strollers chatted quietly on a nearby bench, their babies cooing and giggling in the afternoon sun. She had an important exam coming up next week, and these peaceful study sessions were crucial to her preparation. Unlike some of her classmates who crammed the night before, she believed in steady, consistent preparation. Her organized study guide was proof of that, each page carefully annotated with her neat handwriting, important concepts highlighted in different colors. The light filtering through the oak leaves created dancing patterns on her textbook pages. She'd chosen this particular spot because the old oak tree felt like a protective guardian, its sprawling branches creating a natural study room. Plus, her dad had told her that this section of the park was always well patrolled and safe. As a police captain's daughter, she'd grown up understanding the importance of being aware of her surroundings while still enjoying public spaces. A light breeze flooded the pages of her notebook, carrying the sweet scent of nearby flowering bushes. She adjusted her reading glasses and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, completely absorbed in her studies. Her phone occasionally buzzed with messages from her study group. They were all preparing for the same exam, sharing tips and encouragement through their group chat. Time seemed to flow differently in this peaceful corner of the park. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her blanket as she worked through practice problems, occasionally taking sips from her water bottle. She'd packed her favorite healthy snacks too, apple slices and almonds, brain food as her dad called it. She felt proud of how much she'd accomplished in just a few hours. The complex biological concepts were starting to make more sense, and her confidence was growing with each page she reviewed. This was exactly why she loved studying outdoors. Something about the fresh air and natural surroundings helped her concentrate better than any library or coffee shop ever could. As she reached for her water bottle, she noticed more families arriving at the park, probably parents picking up their kids from nearby schools. The playground area was getting livelier, but her quiet spot remained undisturbed. That's what made this park so special. It had space for everyone, whether you wanted to play, exercise, or study in peace. The police captain's daughter had inherited her father's sense of responsibility and dedication. While other teens might be hanging out at the mall or scrolling through social media, she was here, working toward her dream of becoming a doctor. Her father had always encouraged her ambitions, teaching her that with hard work and determination, she could achieve anything she set her mind to. Just as she was about to start reviewing the chapter on photosynthesis, a shadow fell across her textbook. Looking up, she expected to see another friendly park visitor passing by. Instead, she found herself facing a situation that would change not just her afternoon, but the entire community's understanding of justice and equality. Little did she know that her peaceful study session was about to become the catalyst for a series of events that would shake the city's law enforcement to its core. Her father's position in the police force and her own innocence would soon collide with a harsh reality that many had faced before her, but this time things would be different. The gentle spring day was about to take an unexpected turn, transforming from a simple study session into a moment that would spark crucial conversations about power, justice, and change in their community. But for now, she was just a dedicated student, surrounded by the beauty of nature, unaware of how the next few minutes would change everything. The peaceful afternoon took a sharp turn when a police cruiser pulled up along the park's curved pathway. The officer inside had received a vague call about suspicious activity in the park, the kind of imprecise report that required careful judgment and assessment. But something was different about this officer's approach from the very beginning. He stepped out of his vehicle with an air of authority that seemed excessive for a routine park check. His hand rested heavily on his belt as he surveyed the area, his canine partner waiting alertly in the back seat. The park's usual calm atmosphere shifted as he began walking with purposeful strides, passing right by several groups of people until his attention fixed on the young student studying under the oak tree. The officer's boots crunched on the gravel path as he approached, casting a long shadow over the girl's textbooks. Without any introduction or explanation, he demanded to know what she was doing there. His tone was harsh, a sharp contrast to the peaceful environment of the park. The young student looked up from her biology notes, momentarily confused by the confrontational approach. "I'm just studying for my AP exam, sir," she explained politely, gesturing to her clearly displayed textbooks and notes. Her voice remained steady, though her heart had begun racing. She'd been raised to respect law enforcement, taught by her father about proper police procedures and citizen rights. This interaction, however, wasn't following any of the protocols she knew about. The officer's response was unexpected and unsettling. Instead of acknowledging her explanation, he insisted that there had been reports of suspicious activity. When she carefully reached for her student ID to prove she was exactly who she claimed to be, he took a step back and called for his canine partner to exit the vehicle. Other park visitors began to notice the escalating situation. A couple pushing a stroller slowed their walk, concern evident on their faces. Two joggers stopped their run, sensing something wasn't right. The officer's behavior was becoming increasingly aggressive, despite the student's calm and cooperative demeanor. "You need to pack up and leave immediately," he ordered, his hand still resting on his belt. The young girl looked around, bewildered. She had done nothing wrong, was breaking no laws, and was simply studying in a public park. The same park her father, a police captain, had recommended for its safety and peaceful atmosphere. "Sir, I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly but maintaining its respectful tone. "I'm just studying here. Could you please explain what suspicious activity was reported?" It was a reasonable question, asked politely, but it seemed to agitate the officer further. By now, several bystanders had taken out their phones, their instincts telling them to document what was happening. The afternoon sun caught the lens of one phone after another as more people stopped to witness the increasingly tense situation. The officer noticed this too, but rather than moderating his approach, he seemed to become more agitated. The T9 dog stood at attention beside his handler, picking up on the officer's tension. The student began carefully gathering her study materials, trying to keep her movements slow and visible. Her hands shook slightly as she closed her textbook, the detailed notes she'd been taking now forgotten in the face of this unexpected confrontation. "I said pack up and leave now," the officer repeated, his voice rising. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, their expressions a mixture of concern and disbelief. A mother pulled her children closer, whispering something into her phone. An elderly man shook his head in disapproval, his years of experience telling him this wasn't right. The girl's phone buzzed in her pocket, probably her study group wondering why she'd stopped responding to their messages. But she didn't dare reach for it, not with the officer's current demeanor. Instead, she continued carefully packing her belongings, her movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. The officer's next action shocked everyone present. He reached for his radio, calling in what he claimed was a non-compliant subject, despite the girl's clear cooperation. The park had gone eerily quiet, the earlier sounds of children playing and birds chirping replaced by tense silence and worried murmurs. What happened next would be captured on dozens of phones, shared across social media, and eventually make its way to the police captain's desk. The officer, ignoring all standard procedures and basic human dignity, made a decision that would not only change his career, but would spark a crucial conversation about power, prejudice, and accountability in law enforcement. As the sun continued its arc across the sky, casting long shadows through the oak trees, no one in the park could have predicted how this interaction would ripple through their community. The young student, still trying to understand why her peaceful study session had turned into this frightening confrontation, was about to experience something that would test her faith in the system her father had dedicated his life to serving. The tension in the air was palpable as the officer's hand moved toward his canine partner's leash, his next actions about to transform a simple afternoon in the park into a moment that would demand justice and change. The gathered crowd held their collective breath, phones recording, as the situation teetered on the edge of a dangerous escalation. Time seemed to slow down in that moment at the park. The sunshine that had earlier felt so warm and comforting now felt harsh and exposing as the officer's grip tightened on his canine's leash. The young student's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her composure, something her father had taught her through countless dinner table conversations about staying calm under pressure. "Please, sir," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I have my student ID right here." She pointed to the card partially visible in her backpack's front pocket, careful not to make any sudden movements. The growing crowd of onlookers continued recording, their phones capturing every second of the escalating situation. A woman pushing a stroller stepped forward, her voice breaking through the tension. "Officer, she's just a kid studying. I've been walking past her for the last hour." But the officer wasn't interested in witness statements or reasonable explanations. His face had hardened into an expression of stubborn authority, his judgment clouded by something deeper than just a suspicious activity call. The German shepherd beside him sensed the growing tension, its ears perked forward, trained eyes fixed on the young student. These dogs were supposed to be protectors, highly trained partners in law enforcement. But at this moment, the animal was being positioned as a threat, going against everything proper police canine protocols stood for. The student's biology textbook lay half-packed in her bag, the colorful sticky notes she'd used to mark important chapters now scattered on her blanket. A light breeze picked up one of her notebook pages, carrying it a few feet away. She didn't dare move to catch it, not with the officer's threatening stance and his canine partner at the ready. More park visitors had stopped to witness the scene, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. An elderly man with a walking stick shook his head in dismay, muttering about "not in our community." Two teenage boys on skateboards had stopped dead in their tracks, their phones already live-streaming the incident. A teacher from the nearby high school recognized her star student and was frantically making a phone call. The officer's next words sent a chill through the crowd. "I've given you multiple chances to comply." His voice was cold, detached, as if reading from a script he'd written in his mind. But the young student had been complying. Everyone could see that. She'd been nothing but respectful, even in the face of clear intimidation. "Sir, I'm packing up right now," she responded, her hands slightly trembling as she continued gathering her things. Her father's voice echoed in her head, reminding her about her rights, about staying calm, about being strong in the face of injustice. If only the officer knew who her father was, but that shouldn't matter. No one should be treated this way, regardless of who their parents are. The canine took a step forward, responding to its handler's subtle signals. The crowd gasped collectively. Someone shouted, "This isn't right." Another voice called out, "I'm calling the police." The irony of calling the police on the police wasn't lost on anyone present. The student's phone buzzed again in her pocket, probably her father checking in on her study session. How quickly things had changed from a peaceful afternoon of AP biology review to this nightmare scenario. She wanted to reach for her phone, to call for help, but she knew any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. The officer's radio crackled with another unit responding to the scene, but he ignored it. Instead, he issued his next command, one that would be replayed countless times on social media and news reports. "If you don't leave immediately, I'll have no choice but to consider you a threat." The absurdity of considering a studying teenager a threat was lost on him. Phones recorded as the T9 took another step forward, the officer's hand now positioned to release the dog. The student remained frozen, her mind racing between the self-defense lessons her father had taught her and the harsh reality that any defensive movement could make things worse. A mother shielded her young child's eyes while continuing to record. A group of joggers who had stopped to witness the scene were now on their phones, some calling 911, others trying to reach someone they knew in the police department. The park had become an amphitheater of modern justice, with dozens of digital eyes capturing every moment. The student's thoughts turned to her father, wondering what he would do in this situation. He'd always taught her about proper police procedure, about how officers were supposed to de-escalate situations, not create them. This officer was breaking every rule in the book, and she knew it. But knowledge offered little comfort when facing a trained police dog and an officer who seemed determined to abuse his power. The tension reached its breaking point as the officer's grip on the leash shifted. The young student closed her eyes for a brief moment, a silent prayer on her lips. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady, dignified, even in the face of such blatant intimidation. She was her father's daughter after all, and she wouldn't let fear break her spirit. The next few seconds would change everything for the student, for the officer, for the community, and for a police force that would soon have to face its own demons. As the officer's hand moved to release his canine partner, no one in the park could have predicted how this moment of injustice would transform into a catalyst for change, all because a young girl had chosen to study under an oak tree on what should have been just another spring afternoon. Just as the situation reached its breaking point, a black SUV with police lights screeched to a halt at the park entrance. The crowd turned at the sound, phones still recording, as a tall figure in a police captain's uniform emerged. He moved with the urgent precision of someone who had spent decades in law enforcement, taking in the entire scene in seconds. The police captain had been wrapping up a community meeting nearby when the calls and messages started flooding in. Parents from the park, teachers from the local high school, and even some of his own officers had reached out, all with the same message. His daughter was in trouble. He'd made it there in record time, his heart pounding but his mind clear. As he strode across the park grass, his polished shoes collecting dew, he could see his worst fears unfolding. His daughter, his brilliant, hard-working child, was being threatened by a fellow officer who had no idea he was about to face the consequences of his actions. The captain's steps were measured but purposeful, each one bringing him closer to a confrontation he never thought he'd have to face. The officer with the canine was so focused on intimidating the young student that he didn't notice his superior's approach. The crowd parted like a wave, creating a clear path between the captain and the unfolding scene. Some onlookers recognized him immediately. He was well known in the community for his fair leadership and dedication to police reform. "Stand down. Now." The captain's voice carried the weight of authority and barely contained fury. The officer with the canine spun around, his face shifting from aggressive confidence to shock as he recognized his superior. The German Shepherd, better trained than its handler, immediately responded to the commanding voice and sat, its previous threatening posture dissolving. The young student's eyes filled with tears of relief at the sight of her father, but she remained composed, just as he taught her. The captain took in every detail, her scattered study materials, the phones recording everything, the concerned faces of the witnesses. His daughter had done everything right, staying calm in a situation that never should have happened. "Captain, The officer started to explain, but was cut off by a raised hand. The captain's eyes blazed with a controlled anger that made even the most seasoned officers in the crowd take a step back. This wasn't just a superior officer intervening, this was a father protecting his child while upholding his oath to serve and protect. "Secure your canine in your vehicle immediately," the captain ordered, his voice level but carrying an edge that left no room for argument. As the officer complied, the captain turned to the gathering of witnesses, his posture straightening into one of professional authority. "I want to thank everyone who called this in. Your quick action prevented what could have been a serious incident." Several people in the crowd nodded, their phones still recording. The captain's presence had transformed the atmosphere from one of tension to one of reassurance. This was how a police officer should act, with control, professionalism, and respect for the community they served. The young student finally allowed herself to breathe normally again. Her father approached her carefully, aware of all the eyes watching. He wasn't just her dad at this moment, he was also a symbol of what law enforcement should be. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice carrying both personal concern and professional composure. The crowd watched as she nodded, gathering her study materials with shaking hands. The captain helped her pick up scattered notes, pausing to read the detailed biology annotations. Even in this tense moment, he felt a surge of pride at his daughter's dedication to her studies. This was supposed to be a safe space for her, a place where she could prepare for her future. One by one, witnesses began approaching the captain, offering to share their videos and provide statements. A teacher who had been walking her dog explained how she'd witnessed the entire incident unfold. Two college students described how they'd started recording as soon as they saw the officer's aggressive approach. Each person who stepped forward reinforced what the captain already knew. This incident would not be swept under the rug. The officer who had caused the situation stood by his patrol car, his earlier bravado replaced by the realization that his actions would have consequences. The captain noticed how none of the other responding officers who had arrived made any move to support their colleagues' behavior. They knew this wasn't what they had sworn to protect and serve for. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the park, the captain faced a complex situation. He was both a father and a police leader, roles that were now intertwined in a way he had never expected. This incident would require immediate action, but it would also demand long-term changes to prevent it from happening to anyone else's child. Taking out his own phone, he began making calls to internal affairs, to the police chief, to community leaders. This wouldn't be handled quietly in some back room. His daughter's frightening experience would become a catalyst for the changes he had been pushing for within the department. The young student watched her father work, still shaken but proud of how he handled the situation. She had always known he was respected in the force, but seeing him in action, maintaining professionalism even when his own daughter was threatened, gave her a new appreciation for his leadership. As more police vehicles arrived and the proper procedures began, the captain knew this was just the beginning. The incident would raise difficult questions about power, prejudice, and accountability. But looking at his daughter's face, still composed despite everything she'd been through, he knew this was a fight worth having. The sun was setting over the city as the young student sat in her father's office at the police headquarters. The events in the park had set off a chain reaction that was still unfolding. Her AP biology textbook lay unopened on her lap. Studying seemed impossible now, even though her exam was still coming up next week. The police station was buzzing with unusual activity for this time of day. Officers kept walking past the captain's office, stealing glances through the glass windows. Word had spread quickly about what happened in the park. Some officers looked ashamed, others angry, and a few seemed deeply concerned. The incident hadn't just affected one family, it had shaken the entire department. "Does your arm hurt?" The captain asked his daughter softly, noticing how she kept rubbing her wrist where the K-9 officer had grabbed her while attempting to force her up from her study spot. A medical professional had already checked her over, documenting every mark and scratch. The physical injuries were minor, but they both knew the emotional impact would take longer to heal. Down the hall, in a separate office, the K-9 officer sat facing an internal affairs investigator. His body camera footage was playing on a screen, showing his aggressive approach from the moment he arrived at the park. The timestamps matched perfectly with dozens of civilian videos that had already been uploaded to social media. There would be no denying what had happened. The captain's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since they arrived at the station. Community leaders, fellow officers, reporters, everyone wanted to know how something like this could happen in their city. The young student watched her father answer each call with remarkable patience, even as she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Baby, I need to ask you something important," he said during a brief quiet moment between calls. "Do you want to press charges?" His voice was gentle but serious. This was more than just a father talking to his daughter. This was a police captain asking a victim of police misconduct about their wishes. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. Before she could answer, there was a knock at the office door. The police chief had arrived, his face grave as he took in the scene before him. He'd known this family for years, had watched the captain's daughter grow up, had even attended her middle school graduation. Now he had to face them both in one of the department's darkest moments. "We've got media vans setting up outside," the chief informed them quietly. "And the videos are spreading fast on social media." He didn't need to explain further. In an age where every phone was a camera and every incident could go viral, there was no containing this story. Not that the captain wanted to contain it. This was exactly the kind of incident that needed to see the light of day. The young student checked her own phone, which had been blowing up with messages of support from classmates and teachers. Someone had already created a hashtag about the incident. Her study group chat was filled with concerned messages and offers to help her prepare for the upcoming exam. The community was rallying around her. "I want something good to come from this," she finally said, looking up at her father and the chief. Both men turned to her, surprised by the strength in her voice. This shouldn't happen to anyone else, whether their dad is a police captain or not. Her words hit home, reminding both veterans of why they joined the force in the first place. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Officers came and went, bringing reports and updates. The K-9 officer had been placed on immediate administrative leave. His dog, a well-trained animal who had only responded to its handler's commands, would be reassigned to another officer after a thorough evaluation. As evening fell, more community members gathered outside the police station. They weren't there to protest. They were there to show support for the captain's efforts to address the incident openly and honestly. Some held signs calling for accountability, others simply stood in silent solidarity. The young student watched from the office window as a news crew interviewed one of the park witnesses. The woman was describing how the student had remained calm and respectful even when faced with unjustified aggression. Seeing the incident through someone else's eyes made it feel both more real and more surreal. "I'm proud of you," the captain told his daughter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You handled yourself with more grace than anyone should have to show in that situation." She leaned into her father's comfort, finally allowing herself to process the emotions she'd been holding back. The incident had exposed a raw nerve in the department. Officers who had worked with the captain for years came to express their support, some sharing their own stories of witnessing misconduct but feeling powerless to stop it. This was becoming more than just one incident. It was turning into a moment of reckoning. As they prepared to finally head home, the young student picked up her biology textbook. The corner was slightly bent from when it had fallen during the confrontation. Something so normal as studying for an AP exam had turned into an event that would change not just her life, but potentially the lives of many others in the community. The captain gathered the preliminary reports, witness statements, and medical documentation. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, press conferences, department meetings, and difficult conversations about reform. But tonight, his priority was making sure his daughter felt safe and supported. As they walked through the station, officers and staff members stood in respect, not just for their captain, but for the young student who had faced injustice with dignity. Her father had always taught her about the importance of standing up for what's right. Today, she had learned that sometimes standing up meant standing still, staying strong, and letting the truth speak for itself. The next morning arrived with a sense of purpose at the police headquarters. The captain's office had become the center of an investigation that would reshape the department. Stacks of witness statements covered his desk, each one telling the same story from different angles. The truth was impossible to ignore, captured in high definition by dozens of phones. Early morning sunlight streamed through the windows as the internal affairs team set up in the conference room. They had pulled an all-nighter reviewing body camera footage, not just from yesterday's incident, but from the K-9 officer's entire service record. What they found painted a troubling picture that went far beyond one afternoon in the park. The young student had insisted on coming to the station with her father, despite his suggestion that she take a day off from all this. "I need to see this through," she had told him over breakfast, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that had helped her through yesterday's ordeal. Now she sat in a quiet corner of the office, working on her biology homework while the investigation unfolded around her. "Look at this," one investigator called out, pointing to his screen. The team gathered around as he played footage from 3 months ago. Another incident involving the same officer, another situation that could have been handled differently. Pattern recognition software highlighted aggressive body language and concerning word choices across multiple interactions. The captain stood back, watching the process unfold. As much as he wanted to lead this investigation himself, he knew he had to maintain professional distance. His daughter's case had opened the door, but what they were uncovering went far beyond personal interest. This was about systemic issues that needed addressing. Community members continued streaming into the station throughout the day, each bringing their own stories. An elderly gentleman described a similar encounter from last year. A college student shared video of another aggressive K-9 deployment that had gone unreported. The incident in the park had given people the courage to come forward with their own experiences. In the department's break room, officers gathered in small groups, their conversations hushed but intense. Some defended the old way of doing things, but many more expressed relief that these issues were finally being addressed. Young officers especially seemed eager for change, sharing stories of situations they'd witnessed but felt powerless to challenge. By afternoon, the investigation had expanded beyond one officer. The captain watched as his colleagues dug through years of reports, complaint files, and training records. They found outdated policies, inadequate oversight, and a culture that sometimes valued aggression over de-escalation. His daughter's experience had exposed cracks in the foundation that could no longer be ignored. The media presence outside the station had grown. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. The captain had promised transparency, and now he had to deliver. But first, he needed all the facts, all the evidence, everything that would help ensure real change would come from this. "Dad," his daughter called softly from her corner. She had been watching everything while pretending to study. "Remember when you used to tell me that sometimes the hardest things to fix are the ones we can't see?" He nodded, reminded again of how perceptive she was. This investigation was revealing exactly that, the invisible problems that had been hiding in plain sight. The internal affairs team worked methodically, building a timeline that stretched back years. They'd found complaints that had been dismissed, warnings that had been ignored, and recommendations for additional training that had never been implemented. The K-9 officers' actions in the park weren't an isolated incident, they were a symptom of deeper problems. Outside the captain's office, a group of senior officers had gathered. These were veterans who had served alongside him for years, men and women who had witnessed the department's evolution. They came with concerned faces but determined spirits, ready to acknowledge past mistakes and work toward real solutions. The young student watched as one officer after another stepped forward to share information. Some brought old reports they had filed, others offered testimonies about situations they had witnessed. The thin blue line was transforming into something else, a commitment to transparency and accountability. As evening approached, the investigation team had filled multiple boards with their findings. Red strings connected related incidents, creating a web of evidence that couldn't be dismissed. The captain studied these connections, seeing clearly how yesterday's park incident fit into a larger pattern of behavior that needed to change. His daughter approached the boards, her biology textbook clutched to her chest like a shield. "It's like an ecosystem," she said thoughtfully, drawing on her AP studies. "Everything's connected, and when one part isn't healthy, it affects everything else." The investigators paused their work, struck by the simple wisdom in her words. The sun was setting again as the captain reviewed the preliminary findings. The investigation had uncovered more than just one officer's misconduct. It had revealed the need for comprehensive reform. Training protocols needed updating, oversight needed strengthening, and most importantly, the department's culture needed to change. His daughter sat beside him as he worked, occasionally helping him organize the overwhelming amount of information they had gathered. She had shown remarkable strength throughout this process, turning a traumatic experience into an opportunity for positive change. The captain realized that sometimes the best lessons about justice come from those who have faced injustice with dignity. 3 months had passed since that spring afternoon in the park. The police department's main conference room was packed with officers, community leaders, and media representatives. At the front of the room, the young student stood beside her father, the police captain, as they prepared to announce the changes that had grown from one frightening incident. The room buzzed with anticipation. The captain adjusted his uniform, catching his daughter's eye. She had aced her AP biology exam despite everything that happened, showing the same strength that had helped spark this transformation. Today, she wasn't just a student or a captain's daughter, she was a symbol of how one person's experience could lead to meaningful change. "Good morning," the captain began, his voice carrying the weight of months of hard work. 3 months ago, my daughter was studying in our community park when she encountered something no citizen should face: unwarranted aggression from someone sworn to protect and serve. The room fell silent, everyone remembering the viral videos that had exposed the incident. Behind him, a screen displayed the comprehensive reforms they were implementing. The K-9 officer had been dismissed from the force following a thorough investigation that revealed a history of similar incidents. But this wasn't just about one officer, it was about preventing future abuses of power. The young student stepped forward to share her part of the story. Her voice was clear and confident as she described not just what had happened to her, but what it meant for the community. "I was lucky," she said. "I had support, resources, and a father in a position to make change happen. But this isn't just about me, it's about making sure everyone feels safe in our community." Heads nodded throughout the room. On one wall, newly framed posters outlined the department's updated policies. K-9 units would now require additional training and oversight. Body cameras would be reviewed regularly, not just after incidents. Most importantly, a new civilian oversight committee would help ensure accountability. The chief of police stood to announce the next phase of changes. "We're implementing mandatory de-escalation training for all officers," he explained. "But beyond that, we're changing how we measure success in our department. It's not just about arrests and citations, it's about building trust and keeping our community safe." In the audience, some of the officers who had come forward during the investigation sat with straight backs and proud expressions. Their courage in speaking up about past incidents had helped shape the new policies. The thin blue line hadn't been broken, it had been transformed into a bridge between the police and the community. The young student watched as her father detailed the new training programs. Officers would now spend more time in the communities they served, not just patrolling but participating in community events and getting to know the people they protected. The park where she had been studying would host monthly meet and greets between police and residents. "Change isn't easy," the captain acknowledged, looking around the room. "But it's necessary. What happened to my daughter opened our eyes to problems that had gone unchecked for too long. Now it's our responsibility to make sure those problems never resurface." As the presentation continued, the young student noticed many familiar faces in the crowd. The teacher who had called for help that day in the park. The elderly man who had shaken his head at the injustice. The mother who had shielded her child's eyes while recording the incident. They had all become part of this journey toward change. The new Civilian Oversight Committee was introduced, a diverse group of community members who would work alongside the department to ensure transparency and accountability. The young student had been asked to join as a youth representative, turning her experience into an opportunity to make a difference. After the formal presentation, people gathered in small groups, discussing the changes and sharing their hopes for the future. The young student overheard snippets of conversation, officers talking about how the new training had already improved their interactions with the public, community members expressing gratitude for the increased transparency. Her father was surrounded by reporters, patiently answering questions about the reforms. The young student noticed how he kept steering the conversation back to the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one incident or one department, but about setting an example for police forces everywhere. Outside the station, the summer sun shone brightly. The park where everything had started was visible in the distance, its oak trees swaying gently in the breeze. New benches had been installed, along with better lighting and emergency call boxes. It was still a place for studying, playing, and gathering, but now it was also a symbol of positive change. The young student thought about her upcoming senior year of high school. Her AP biology textbook had been replaced by college preparation materials, but the lessons she had learned went far beyond academics. She had seen how one moment of injustice, handled with dignity and determination, could lead to lasting change. As the event wound down, she joined her father for a final statement to the press. Together, they represented both the catalyst for change and the commitment to seeing it through. The captain's arm around his daughter's shoulders spoke volumes about family, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. "This is just the beginning," the captain concluded, pride evident in his voice. "Real change takes time, commitment, and continuous effort. But today, we've taken important steps toward building a department that truly serves and protects everyone in our community." The young student smiled, thinking about future generations who would benefit from these changes. What had started as a frightening afternoon in the park had become a turning point for their city. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful changes come from the most unexpected moments.